Now, the Israel Defense Forces have really been at the vanguard of grappling with asymmetric warfare and fighting terrorists while respecting international law. And in so many respects, Israel's been at the forefront of developing new approaches and methods for fighting terrorists in response, for example, to the Second Intifada, and more recently to Hamas's tactics of using human shields in terms of people and infrastructure while targeting Israeli civilians. Flagrant violations of international law, the international law of war, which left Israel having to grapple with how to deal with this phenomena and defend itself against these attacks in unique circumstances. Now, Pnina, you led the IDF International Law Department through much of this development. Could you begin by setting out for us what international law says about the principles of distinction and proportionality, and how the IDF has developed its approach and practices in light of the challenges of fighting terrorists?
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. So first of all, when we are fighting these conflicts, these asymmetrical conflicts, we are facing non-state actors, organized armed groups in different levels of organization, fighting from within urban areas, fighting and using civilians as shields. This is a big challenge, but I think what is clear to us and was clear the whole way is that we do have to still apply the law. The fact that the other side is not applying the law, is not respecting it at all, is actually targeting civilians purposefully, using civilians as shields. This does not allow us to disregard the law, because we want to retain our standards, our values, our democratic nature, our rule of law in the state of Israel. So the law is relevant, and we also never questioned its applicability also to these kinds of asymmetrical conflicts. There was a debate after 9/11 whether encountering terrorism, the existing IHL or laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, whatever we call it, are irrelevant. They were made in the thinking of militaries fighting each other, of states, and they're not relevant here. We didn't accept it. We said, this is today's battleground. We have to apply the laws, and the laws of armed conflict actually are flexible. They are based on principles that can be applied and take into account the circumstances and the changing circumstances. That's part of the beauty, you can say, of international law and of IHL. It develops based on the practice of the states, based on the realities that change. And then when we wanted to apply these standards, we said, okay, the main two principles are, as you mentioned, distinction and proportionality. Distinction means that you are allowed to target a military objective or a combatant, and you are not allowed, or you're forbidden to target a civilian or a civilian object. It sounds very simple and straightforward, but what do you do when you're facing organizations that are not classical militaries? They don't wear mostly uniforms. They do wear them when they have parades, but when they start fighting us, they are all in civilian clothes. They don't differentiate themselves from civilians. They are organized in different levels. Are they all civilians, therefore? So first of all, even if they are civilians, the laws of armed conflict acknowledge that this distinction, this immunity of civilians from being targeted, from having an attack directed against them, has a qualification. If the civilian is involved, it takes direct participation in hostilities, what is coined DPH. Once a civilian is directly participating in hostilities, he or she loses their immunity from attack. It's clear. Of course, you cannot, just because you're a civilian, if you're shooting at the forces or throwing at them a bomb, you're not going to be immune from attack. So that's one thing. So even civilians that are really civilians, or we don't know who they are, but once they are a part of the fighting, then they become lawful targets. So if somebody is firing a rocket, even if he's doing it in civilian clothes, he's not a civilian. Secondly, when we have an organization, an organized armed group that we are fighting, then those members of the fighting forces, those members that are involved or assisting the fighting, also become the armed forces of the enemy, and they are not civilians anymore. That was our position from the beginning. There was a dispute between the legal community whether indeed these kinds of people are military objectives or should be combatants that may be targeted. And the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, convened a group of experts. I was one of them, with also people from different from countries where were fighting terrorism, but also NGOs, and they accepted this position. So we see how the law develops. So what the important point is that when we have these kind of people operating, these are not civilians. And when they use a house or a school or a mosque or even a clinic as their battleground, their headquarters, where they store ammunition, where they fire the rockets from, these are not civilian objects anymore. These become military objectives, again, because under IHL, a military objective is also a civilian object that has been used or is being used for military purposes. So when we decide on the legality of the target, we are applying IHL. And we say, is this really just a civilian house or school, or is there a headquarters there? Are they storing their ammunition? Are they firing rockets from there? If they are doing that, then this becomes a lawful target. And this is the law. The problem is that after the fact, when you come to the Gaza Strip, for example, all you see is civilian houses and civilian buildings that have been destroyed. You see civilian casualties. You don't really know who's who. And immediately it is claimed that Israel is breaking the law, is targeting civilians, is targeting civilian objects. This is completely not the law. And it is very difficult to disprove because what you see after the fact is civilian destruction. So that's the principle of distinction. And then the next one is proportionality, because even if I attack a military objective, a lawful target, I still have to assess what would be the collateral damage to civilians and civilian objects. And only if the military advantage that I will get, that I expect to get from this attack is not, only if the collateral damage to civilian and civilian objects that I expect or that I can anticipate that will occur is not excessive to the military advantage that I will seek, only then is it lawful to attack. So I have to do a balancing process between the collateral damage that I expect and the military advantage that I expect. But what is important is that this is an examination that you have to take, that you have to analyze with the knowledge and the estimation taken by the commander at the time of making the decision, not with the benefit of hindsight. And then people say, oh, if civilians were killed or harmed, that means automatically that it was disproportionate. But maybe this was not anticipated. Maybe we didn't anticipate that there were civilians there. We had a very famous case where there was intelligence. It was a targeted killing of Shahade, one of the commanders of the military forces of the Hamas. And the intelligence said he was at home with his wife and with his assistants that were all also members of the organization. And he was targeted at home. There was a shed next door to the home, a shed. And according to the intelligence, it was supposed to be empty. Unfortunately, it wasn't empty. There were civilians there, they were killed. And there were 11 or 12 civilians that were killed. Immediately, it was claimed that Israel acted disproportionately. But this is not the exam. This is not the way to examine a proportionality. You have to check what did we know at the time, what were the estimations, and the standard is a standard of a reasonable military commander. So we apply the law, but eventually we are being examined with standards that don't reflect the law, don't reflect the realities of combat situations, use the benefit of hindsight, and are usually, and many times, really very unfair.
And what you've described on proportionality is a judgment call. I want to come to Richard in a minute to talk about his experiences of these same issues, but we've had one of the initial questions through already, which goes right to this point, this individual asks, how can one weigh two unlikes in warfare, i.e. military advantage against unintentional civilian targets or collateral damage? So how is that balancing process in practice carried out?
So it's a very good question because it's a very difficult analysis and there's no formula. And as I said, the standard is a reasonable military commander, and you have to make the best assessment you can under the very uncertain circumstances you are operating in. And it's different also if the decision is made in headquarters level, we have more time to think about it, or you have more intelligence, or on the ground by the commander that is being fired at, and there also he has less intelligence, less time to think about things. So that also has to be taken into consideration. The main thing is that you have to take into account the collateral damage. If someone says, I don't care if there are civilians there, let's say I gave a warning and whoever decided to stay, that's their problem, I'm not going to count them, that's unlawful. And we are very clear about this to the commanders and the soldiers in our lectures that we give and in the preparation and drills. But once you do take that into account, so first of all, you do the best you can to assess what will be the harm, and you do the balance, and the military advantage changes at a certain point. If at the moment there are rockets being fired, and this is our reality, rockets are being fired at our localities, at our homes and children, the kindergartens. So we are under a barrage of rockets. So the military advantage of stopping this is very big. Okay, and then the collateral damage can also be reasonably big. I mean, again, it's in how many lives, it's very difficult to weigh. But if it's a situation that we have more time and the risk is smaller, then it would be a different kind of balance. So another point that is very important, beyond proportionality, we also have the obligation to take precautions. So another obligation is to take precautions to minimize harm to civilians as much as possible, as much as the feasible precautions, which includes also warning in advance, but also includes using, let's say, a smaller, lighter ammunition, or a smaller, like a half-ton instead of a one-ton bomb, all kinds of these kinds of considerations in order to use what can still give you the military advantage, but minimize harm. So that's another obligation that we have.
And in terms of distinction, I've got two other short questions that are very much on point before we move on, that have come from the audience. If the civilian acts only once, for how long does he lose his immunity? And the second one, which goes to the same point, is I'm interested in Pnina's view on the revolving door scenario. So this is people who are civilians the majority of the time, but occasionally take up arms, target Israel. And the questioner says this might include people, even children, who send fire balloons to Israel. Can those be legitimately target, and if so, under what circumstances?
So here again, first of all, I would make a differentiation between civilians that are really a civilian, like a child, or a civilian that just now threw a kind of grenade or a Molotov cocktail, and that's it, and stopped. Then I think at that stage, they would not continue to be a lawful target unless it's immediately after that you can still see it as part of the attack. But if it's a member of an organization, of let's say of the organized armed group that we are facing, let's say the military wing of the Hezbollah, or the military wing of the Hamas, then such a person is a member of the armed forces of the other side, and he or she are targetable as a member of the armed forces. As a soldier on our side is targetable all the time, according to IHL, by the enemy forces, even if they are not at that moment involved in fighting, or even if the position is not a fighting position. Then the same rationale should apply to the armed forces of the other side, even if they belong to an organized armed group that is not into a non-state. So that is our analysis. And as I said, this analysis was accepted by a group of experts, very highly regarded experts, and the ICRC, that in such a case, they are the armed forces, and then we don't examine what exactly are they doing at any moment, but if they are members of the armed forces of the other side, then they are lawful targets, like soldiers.
So we've got the principles and the analysis and how that has been applied to this particular scenario. We've also got the precautions that you've mentioned, and I'm sure our audience will be very familiar of those that have developed through the Gaza conflicts, warning shots, phone calls to householders, individual text messages, the development of the knock-on roof protocol, and leaflets distributed warning civilians of strikes against Hamas installations. Now, Richard, you've spent a lifetime, I hope you don't mind my saying, combating terrorism on the ground as a British Army officer and an intelligence professional. And you've also had personal experience of, I believe, the approach that Pnina has outlined on visits to the Gaza border that you've conducted. So could you tell us, with the benefit of your professional experience, what do you make of the IDF's approach to fighting terrorism?
Well, before I answer that, can I just say what a real pleasure it is to be taking part in this webinar. I have huge admiration for UK Lawyers for Israel. They're a fantastic group, do absolutely brilliant work, and I've had many dealings with them in the past and hope to in the future. And in particular, a pleasure to be present on this panel with Natasha and Pnina. They say, I think, a thorn between two roses, I think probably is a way to describe it. If that's not too sexist, perhaps it is, but I don't know.
No, you're a rose between two roses.
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I mean, I have spent my lifetime, and as you can see, I'm an extremely old man, dealing with these problems. And the first time really that I commanded troops facing the threat of terrorists who were trying to use human shields, trying to merge into the civilian population in the same way as Israel deals with day in, day out in Gaza and sometimes in Judea and Samaria as well, was when I was 19 years old in Belfast. And my experience, and actually the Northern Ireland campaign is extremely similar, I think, to the campaign that the IDF have been dealing with in Judea and Samaria, closer to that than it is to Gaza. And I've encountered numerous situations where I've had to make, even as a relatively young man, judgment calls about whether I should or should not use lethal force in a given situation. And all of the different factors that Pnina has outlined are factors that we also took into account, because of course Britain and Israel fight according to the same laws of war and pretty much according to the same rules of engagement, which effectively are the instructions that are given to a soldier in a specific campaign to ensure that his action is within the laws of armed conflict. So he's not expected to be a lawyer or an expert on every single aspect of the laws of war, but he is given simplified rules by which he can fight. And we had that, the IDF have that. One example that I faced more recently than when I was 19 was when I was in Afghanistan. And I had to make a decision about whether or not to carry out a military strike against a terrorist cell that was held up within a civilian apartment block in Kabul. And you know, absolutely that decision came down to proportionality. Was it proportionate to do that strike, risking very real risk of civilian deaths in order to eliminate or capture a terrorist cell that was heavily armed with explosives? And it was, I have to say, I was a relatively senior commander at the time, but I had a lot of other people all over the case telling me what I should and shouldn't do, from somewhere in London, you know, 5,000 miles away, to the British ambassador in Kabul. And any level of commander, whatever your experience is, when you have to make these judgment calls, and at the same time you've got lots of other people giving you conflicting advice, it is not simple and not straightforward. But you know, and again, as Pnina said, if you make an assessment as the commander that that what you do is proportionate and necessary to your operational tasks, and at the same time, if you discriminate and you take careful precautions to try and ensure that whatever fire you're directing is directed against the enemy terrorists and not the civilians all around, and it was a apartment block in this case that was jam-packed with Afghan civilians, probably all, certainly the vast majority, no connection to terrorism whatsoever. So it's sometimes it's straightforward, and sometimes it's tougher, the decision making. Sometimes it's relatively clear, sometimes it's far from clear. And again, you've got to get a picture in order to understand whether your actions are proportionate. You have to have an understanding of the implications of not doing what you're about to do, just as you have to understand the implications of doing it in terms of potential civilian casualties. Now, the question you asked was how I, with that sort of background that I've had in different theatres, how I would judge the way that the IDF fight. Well, I've experienced IDF military operations over all three campaigns, intensive campaigns in Gaza, starting with Cast Lead and ending with Protective Edge, and on top of that, close witnessing of the most recent operations that the IDF have been carrying out along the Gaza border, dealing with the months and months and months of concerted rioting and attempts to break through the border fence. And when looking at that, I didn't have to restrict myself to sitting back and watching from where the journalists were watching, but I was allowed to go right to the front line, position myself with snipers, with observers, with commanders, and see how they were doing it. And I have to say, although that particular operation along the Gaza border drew more criticism probably than many other operations the IDF have carried out, I have to say that they carried them out with enormous skill. They used the same type of tactics as we would have used in those circumstances. They were, in my view, they were relentless at ensuring that not only were they effective against the people trying to attack them, but also effective about trying to prevent innocent civilian casualties. And in many ways, that's what I've said throughout all of the operations I've observed. I've been able to draw that conclusion in relation to the IDF. But it isn't just my conclusion. I went over to Israel a couple of years back with a thing called the High Level Military Group, which was about a group of about 10, 15 retired generals from armies and air forces around the world to analyze the campaigns in Gaza. And none of them had any particular links to Israel or affinity to Israel or even expertise in Israel, but they were all top-level experts in their own profession. Some of them were former chiefs of staff, heads of the Air Force, heads of intelligence, this sort of thing. And they came to exactly the same conclusion as I had. And their biggest difficulty in the report they wrote, and it's available online, highlevelmilitarygroup.org or whatever is the website, the report they wrote declared that they unanimously had, the greatest concern they had was that their own armed forces would not be able to achieve the same standards in protecting the lives of innocent civilians as the IDF had achieved. And partly that's not because they're less moral as armies. It's not because they train less or are less careful than the IDF. It's partly, not entirely, but partly it's because the IDF, whether you say it's fortunate or unfortunate, but in dealing with Gaza, the IDF is dealing with a relatively small area over which they've had to conduct military operations for many years and have the most extraordinary intelligence and surveillance capability, which makes it so much easier when you're dealing with differentiating between civilian and military casualties. Intelligence is critical. And I'm not talking just about knowledge of who is who, but real-time monitoring of communications, seeing who is talking to whom, having a depth of understanding to know what that voice means, what it is, who it is in some cases, as well as aerial surveillance conducted from drones, from barrage balloon types things, aircraft, helicopters, etc. So, you know, and I would say that in relation to their military operations in Gaza, the IDF concentrate enormous effort, enormous, not just human, but physical and resource effort into doing everything they can to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians on the battlefield, while at the same time, critically, while at the same time being effective and protecting the people of Israel. And one other thing I'll just say in conclusion, which people often don't really pay much attention to, when they accuse the IDF of deliberately killing innocent civilians. Of course, in some circumstances, the IDF do act wrongly, as we do in the British Army, and soldiers make mistakes in the pressures of battle. I mean, I guess everyone watching this video today has probably made maybe a dozen mistakes since you got up this morning in different things, and I certainly have. Whether you don't do something on time, whether you forget something, I don't know what it might be, you don't turn the gas on or whatever it is, and no one's trying to kill you. So people are trying to kill these guys, and they are obviously going to be making mistakes. Human error creeps in, and that is something that I've addressed the UN Human Rights Council on this, their investigations. They can't really understand that aspect of it. They find that very hard to understand, that human error is possible. All you have to do is consider that in every army, tragically, I hate to say this, and I've been involved in it myself, personally and directly, every army, you have what they call blue on blues, where soldiers shoot each other. They shoot their own side sometimes. Fortunately, it doesn't happen that often, but it happens. I'm always astonished it doesn't happen more often. But that is the reality. And no one would say, I don't think, except in the most extreme, rare circumstances, that they deliberately shot their own soldiers. And by the same token, mostly, they don't deliberately shoot innocent civilians. Sometimes it's a mistake, sometimes it's just impossible to avoid. And the final thing really on all this is, again, something that people don't take much into account of. It's not just necessary for Israel to act within the law at war, and Britain, all these things apply to every army. Also to take account of the media perspective, which is extremely important, and which I know is fed into military operations in the IDF as it is in Britain, just the same. The political dimension, which is critically important. And the thing that people don't really think about unless they've served, I think, generally speaking, is the effect on soldiers that these sort of operations have. And the first Gulf War in 1991, which I think was the anniversary is about now, it occurred. I fought in the first Gulf War. And one of the reasons that the attack on the Iraqi forces was ordered to stop when it did stop was because aircraft pilots were saying, we cannot carry on just carrying out this butchery. They were bombing and machine gunning retreating Iraqis, legal, perfectly legal, bombing and machine gunning them, and they had no defense. And they were saying, basically the pilots were saying, we can't do this. And I think the same is true if I think a commander has to take account of the psychological effect on his soldiers if they are not constrained in the way that the law requires them to be constrained. And a majority of Israeli soldiers and British soldiers, American soldiers, every other kind of soldiers in Western armies I've encountered certainly do not want to kill innocent civilians. And that's another factor, again, that few recognize.
And of course, while the rules of engagement of the IDF are not made public, the IDF makes no secret of the moral compass, perhaps, and its humanitarian responsibility that it instills in soldiers, certainly through COGAT and through every unit of the IDF in that sense. Well, Richard, you've touched on the international assessment of this in terms of the media. Everything that we've all heard from the both of you so far is so different to the treatment by the international community and the international media of the approach of the IDF. Pnina, I know that you've looked in detail at reports by the UNHRC. Perhaps you can give us an indication of your sense of why you think the reporting and the international analysis of Israel's approach seems so topsy-turvy.
Yes, I think I analyzed the report of the Commission of Inquiry that was established by the Human Rights Council with regard to protective edge. It was a decision or a resolution that was made during the while the operation was still going on, and as usual, there was a condemnation of Israeli crimes, and they set a commission of inquiry, which always seems to me a little bit putting the carriage before the horses. But so the commission of inquiry that in the beginning was supposed to be headed by Charles Shabas, but then it came about that he was consulting the Palestinians on how to approach the ICC with regard to Israel, the International Criminal Court. So he had to step and was paid for it. So he had to step aside, and eventually it was headed by Mary McGavin Davis, and they also together with Mr. Dayen from Senegal, I think, and they wrote a very detailed report that they got less attention than the Goldstone report, the famous Goldstone report that followed the Cast-Lead operation. Cast-Lead was the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. Protective Edge was in 2014. So I analyzed this report, and it was really written in a more balanced language, I would say, than the Goldstone report. So it seemed as if it was a little bit trying to be more balanced, but when you looked into the report, I found so many, I would say, errors, misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and bias, which are very unfortunate in my view, because it means that these kinds of reports, instead of having a positive role in helping militaries, we want to apply the rules, we want to minimize harm to civilians. These kinds of reports and this kind of body could have had a positive role, but what it does is that it is so one-sided, and it is so clear that it is politically motivated, that it loses any positive role and has a negative role. And I will just give some examples. First of all, on the factual level, the fact, since they were not in the area, so they just took any allegation that was made against Israel and put it down there. And by the way, if there was any explanation by Israel, they always either disregarded it or put it with a lot of question marks. Israel claims, so Israel bombed, and then Israel claims that the site was used for military activities. So already, again, the bias and also the facts were not there. So anybody who said, they even write in the report that they know that people in the Gaza Strip were hesitant. They were interviewing them with Hamas people being present. So they said, naturally, people are hesitant to say that the Hamas was using places for military, making military use of places. And of course, they were very aware that what they need to say. And still, they would then say, well, according to everybody we interviewed, there was no military activity, nothing was taking place from this house, and then suddenly out of the blue, it was bombed. So, I mean, and Israel claims that there was, and this is put with like a question mark, and like Israel is giving an excuse. So the facts were not there. And then you saw also that the law was twisted. And I won't go into the deeper legal analysis, but also with regard to who is a civilian, any case of doubt, with regard to precautions, there were many misrepresentation, a lot of cases of misrepresentation of the law. And also you saw that there was no understanding or attempt to understand the realities of a combat situation. One example was that they say there, this is in the part referring to the ground operations. So they say there that a group of civilians that was fleeing one area, one neighborhood, found themselves, that's according to the report, yes, found themselves in crossfire between the IDF and Hamas fighters. They don't call them fighters, of course, but Hamas operatives. And then they say these people were not holding any weapons, were not causing any threat, and still the IDF killed them. I mean, they say that they got caught in the crossfire. First of all, there's no even potential assumption maybe they were killed by Hamas fire. Secondly, if there is crossfire, so of course these were not the object of the attack. They were not trying to kill the civilians. They were caught in the crossfire, and still Israel is blamed for targeting civilians in such a scenario. So I think this is just one example. There are many examples of this kind of complete disregard to the operational realities. And then you see the bias. And I think the worst part of the bias, except as I said, that everything the Hamas says is always taken, whatever is positive that they say is taken as it is. And if the Hamas, if there's any statement of the Hamas that is negative for the Hamas, it's put with a question mark, and Israel exactly the opposite. But I think what I found even the most disturbing is that in the recommendations, most of them, of course, are against Israel. There is also some recommendations that Hamas shouldn't target civilians, but there's not any mention of the Hamas using civilians as shields, operating from within civilian localities. No recommendation that this, for example, should be dealt with, that this is a breach of the law. And I think this is why these kinds of commissions of inquiry and these kinds of bodies are actually, I would say, actually pushing or encouraging these kinds of organized armed groups to continue using these kinds of tactics that endanger civilians. These are the tactics that kill civilians because they gain having a lot of pressure on the military facing them, whether it is the IDF or the UK military or the US military, because they get sanctioned for any kind of civilian harm. And the organization or the non-state or the terrorists that are using this tactic, it's not even mentioned in the recommendations. There's something wrong that they've been doing. So why shouldn't they go on with this tactic? And I think this is very unfortunate because you see that it's not really that they want to protect civilians. They really want to go after and delegitimize Israel and other militaries.
Richard, I want to ask you about your experience, and I'm afraid it's going to have to be brief because we've got questions flooding in on more topics than you can possibly imagine. But there's a question here, I believe to you, asking if you were able to assess the impact on your audience when you addressed the United Nations, because you in fact gave evidence to this inquiry. Is that right?
I mean, I've given evidence to 4 UN investigations, and I've also spoken at emergency sessions of the UN Human Rights Council, considering the investigation reports for all of the Gaza conflicts. And the first thing to say, and I will try and be brief, do kick me under the screen or whatever if I bang on too long. Mm-hmm. But the first thing to say is that I absolutely agree 100% with what Pnina said, which is the bias of the UN Human Rights Council and the people working for them. And in my evidence sessions with them and the speeches I gave to them, that bias was absolutely palpable. And it starts off with the mandate given to the commissions of investigation, which are biased mandates right from the beginning. It doesn't really give them a choice. And we've seen the outcome of that in every case. And the second thing, I think, is that as far as I recall, not one of those investigations had a military expert as part of it. They had lawyers, they had human rights experts, but they were considering a military conflict, and they didn't have military experts, with the exception of the CAST-led investigation led by Justice what was his name? Goldstone. That's the guy. And their military advisor, their military expert, was an Irish colonel who had a track record of being anti-Israel, a long track record of being anti-Israel, and was a colonel in an army that has never fought a war. And they were dealing mainly with the consideration of air operations, and they don't have an air force. So where his experience was coming from, I don't know. But sorry, the final thing on that is that I was asked to be the military advisor actually on one of these commissions. by the chairman of the commission. I think it might have been Mary McGowan Davies, can't remember. And then suddenly it was withdrawn, the request that I should do it was withdrawn, when obviously staff there looked into my background and found that I might not be sympathetic with their anti-Israel bias. But in terms of the audience, I mean, when you speak at the UN Human Rights Council, it's a huge room with a very large number of people in it, very large number of ambassadors and their staffs. And the looks on their faces that you can see, to me, were horrified. Obviously, you know, there were one or two, like the Australians, the Americans, clearly the Israelis, who were not horrified by the remarks I made, which I believe were objective and truthful remarks about the reality from my military perspective. But the majority were horrified. And I think the reaction of many of them is summed up by, after the last speech I gave in the UN Human Rights Council, the Palestinian Authority ambassador stood up and said, that man has been paid $30,000 US for the lies he has told you today. And I wasn't allowed to speak at that point, but I thought, I wish I had been. I wouldn't. I'd be happy to speak here all day for $30,000 a time.
Set the record straight on that one.
Right, yeah. So you know, I think in most of their eyes, if you're saying something that is not condemning Israel, then you're either being paid for it or you're probably just somehow a member of the Zionist conspiracy. But I went after each of these, or during each of these debates, I walked around and spoke to some of the ambassadors in the intervals, and I would say to an ambassador, why did you say what you just said? You know, you made this comment about the IDF. Why did you say that? And they just didn't know. They were given something to read, they read it, and that was it. They didn't know what they were talking about. They're just happy to be sitting there condemning Israel and waiting for their Mercedes to go and pick them up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and take them back to their taxpayer-funded luxury residence.
Well, in the remaining time, I'm going to try and put as many of these questions to the two of you as possible. And Pnina, if I can start by taking you back to your days as a legal officer and putting to you, I imagine, the sort of questions that would come across your desk on a daily basis. Someone's asked, is a Hamas police station a military target on day one of a war?
The Hamas police in general is not a military objective. If it's dealing with policing, then it is not considered part of the military establishment of the other side. But if a police station or members of the police have a role in the situation of an armed conflict that is to support the military, they have also a military role, then they can become a military objective because of this role. In Israel, for example, you have the border police. If it deals only with policing, so it's not a military objective. But when the border police is involved in actions that are related to, or if they even have a role that they are supposed to assist the military if we are in an armed conflict situation, then they are lawful targets. Also, in the situation in Gaza, many of the members of the Hamas, of the armed wing of the Hamas, had a day job of being police members. So then they would be lawful targets because they are members of the fighting forces of the Hamas, notwithstanding the fact that they are policemen, not because they are policemen. So that's so those are the that's the general legal framework that applies.
And another quick fire question, if I may. In a conflict mainly fought in a built-up area, what are the rules on entering, searching, and using properties where there may be non-combatants?
So again, when you're in an armed conflict, the rules the general rules of targeting are, as I said, but in addition to that, you all the time have to balance between security considerations and protection of civilians and civilians' rights. So if you enter into a house that is suspected, when you're looking for suspects or you're looking for weapons, or even you need the house to put there a post for your intelligence or So then you have to balance all the time. You have to minimize the harm to civilians. You have to treat them with respect. There's also the ethics code, how to treat civilians. So it's not forbidden, because if you have a military necessity, if there is military necessity, then you're allowed to carry out such an act, but you have to balance it. You have to do it in a way that minimizes the harm and balances the interests of the civilians there.
We've had a couple of questions on technology in armed conflict. One is, how has the rise of drones changed the rules, or has it changed them? And someone else asks, in the future, how will developing combat technology affect balanced decisions and military judgment calls? And I'd love to have both of your views on that. So Pnina, if you want to start us off. Sorry.
Okay, so drones are a platform. So the rules that apply to drones would be, in my view, and it's not only my view, I mean, these are the experts also, most experts in IHL, also accept that the rules on drones would be the same as the rules that apply to a piloted aircraft. You still have to respect distinction, proportionality, precautions. In a certain extent, drones could be seen sometimes as a kind of precaution, because by using a drone, you have the ability to stay longer in the air. There's no risk to the pilot, so you can wait until you are more certain about the target and about whether there are civilians near the target. So it can be a kind of precaution actually to minimize harm. It is not an illegal platform. And again, it's just a platform. The rules would be the same. And the same, I think, if we had any kind of autonomous weapons. This is a big debate. I think the main concern is that such kind of autonomous weapons, there needs to be, in my view, some kind of human in the loop, and we have to make sure that they can respect, again, the rules of IHL. If that can be done, then again, the use of the autonomous weapon is a kind of platform. If that cannot be done, then it already raises an issue of using something that could be violating IHL or violating for example, the obligation not to carry out indistinctive attacks.
And Richard?
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I would just add a couple of brief thoughts. Firstly, in terms of the drones, one of the biggest, I've debated this issue many times with many people who, and there seems to be quite a feeling that drones represent a new level of inhumanity. And I think that particularly is prompted by the drone campaign by President Obama, predominantly in the Pakistani border regions, targeting Al-Qaeda. And one of the biggest objections to drones seems to me to be from people that disagree with their use, that it doesn't, it takes the danger away from our side. If you've got no pilot in the aircraft, there's no danger to us. And that's got to be bad. And my reaction to that is that, well, you volunteer to go and do it. Then if you're the one that wants to get shot down or put your life on the line, then you volunteer to do it. But actually, the best possible weapon is a weapon that doesn't cause a threat to our people. And indeed, as Pnina has said, if you've got a weapon like a drone that can be loitering over a target area with no risk to a pilot, that's obviously got to be a great plus, because it gives you much more flexibility in being discriminating and hitting the target when you can most safely hit it from the point of view of not killing innocent civilians. And the other point about, and I agree, none of this changes the laws of armed conflict. And there obviously does have to be human intervention in many of these cases in order that the law can be properly applied. But we've been using autonomous systems actually with a relatively small level of human intervention for at least for 100 years, possibly more, in the form of minefields and unmanned mines, in which you either position a mine above the ground or on the ground, underground, or in the sea. Once they're positioned, you don't have control of them. They trigger themselves when an enemy vehicle or an enemy person walks over or drives over them. But there are very strict laws that are applied to the way that minefield has to be laid and recorded under a number of different treaties. So this change, yes, it's probably going to be more common, it's going to be more diverse, but I don't think it really does alter fundamentally any aspect of the laws of war.
Unfortunately, I feel like we need to have organised 5 of these webinars, because the questions that we've had on Iran combating the financing of terror, the legality of targeted killings, detail on human shields, and the IDF internal investigation procedures, the Military Advocate General Corps, all of those, I think, deserve their own individual webinar. And I'm desperately sorry to say that we're running out of time. But one of the questions that has also been posed is particularly topical. And I know that Richard, yesterday you published an article on this, and Pnina, you were involved in early stages of a lot of the groundwork of the legal framework. And so while it's not strictly about fighting terrorists, I think it's probably a decent enough area to end on. And that is the recent allegations that Israel has been discriminating against Palestinians with the coronavirus vaccine rollout. Indeed, allegations that it's been in breach of requirements of international law. And I'd love to have your input, Pnina, and then Richard in the few last 7 minutes remaining.
Okay, so first of all, the Palestinian Authority that is controlling the West Bank is in charge and has the powers and responsibilities with regards to health of the Palestinians there, all Palestinians there, also those living in Area C, without going into the definitions. This is according to the interim agreement that was signed in 1995. Actually, it was in a previous agreement. And there is a specific section on health. I actually drafted it. And it is indeed discharging these powers and responsibilities, this authority, ever since 1995. There is also an article there about cooperation with regard to epidemiological issues, and there has been cooperation. Israel has cooperated with the Palestinians also with regard to coronavirus, also, and in spite of the fact that the Palestinian Authority at one stage cut all liaison ties with Israel. It was its decision to do it because of President Trump's deal of the century. But nevertheless, there were avenues that were thought and ways to continue cooperating on health issues despite this. And so essentially, this is their responsibility, and Israel is responsible, of course, not to hinder it and to cooperate and to assist as much as possible. But it doesn't have a direct obligation to provide vaccines to the Palestinians that are, again, under the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. With regard to the Gaza Strip, it's even less so, because Israel has left the Gaza Strip, it does not control it. It controls some of the external perimeter, not all of it, because it has a border with Egypt. But it is not, in my view, occupying Gaza anymore. And there you have the Hamas government. Now, until recently, also the Palestinian Authority didn't ask, or the Hamas didn't ask Israel to supply it with vaccines. It had direct connections with a few companies and has agreements on purchasing vaccines. It also has, I think, an understanding with the WHO on getting vaccines under, I don't remember, Codex, or the name of a program. Okay. So it's also operating. It's not that it's not functioning. So there's no real source for this obligation. Israel has gone very ahead with its vaccination program, but when you compare it also to the rest of the world, the other part of the world, the Palestinian Authority is in a better situation than most of Western Europe with regard to cases, and they also have agreements on vaccinations that will arrive. Of course, if Israel has enough vaccines, it will give them also and will share them with the Palestinians, because it is in our interest that there the COVID doesn't continue to spread there and reach us again. We have many Palestinians coming and working in Israel. So this is really something that only in the last week or so, the Palestinians, I think, noticed that this is a good propaganda issue, and why they didn't approach Israel until now, and there were no claims that Israel was not doing what it should until now, they raised it, and I think it got a lot of traction, mainly in the UK, but it's really a propaganda more than anything. It's not the case. If they were dying there and we would do nothing and would say it's your responsibility and we have no responsibility, I would be the first to come and say, yes, we have a certain responsibility because we do have a level of control on the West Bank. And even in the Gaza Strip, we have more responsibility to the Gazans than to, I don't know, the Cypriots. But this is not the case. So here you're trying to find that Israel has a positive obligation to give the same standard that it gives to its civilians, also to the Palestinians that are not under its responsibility. And remember, the Palestinians are the ones claiming that they are a state when they go to the ICC. So if you're a state for going to the ICC, to International Criminal Court, and you have the powers to apply your responsibility towards the civilians, it can't be, suddenly it becomes very convenient to claim that Israel is responsible for everything. They wouldn't let us go in there and they act because it's not, it's outside our, where we are supposed to operate, but it's, when it comes outside to propaganda, it sounds good to blame us of a double standard. These are our civilians that we have a duty for. The Palestinians, we have duties, but not in this regard.
And Richard, your article was incredibly comprehensive yesterday.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I will try and be brief, but you know, Pnina's explained the kind of legal position on this, and you said, Natasha, at the beginning that this is a different subject to fighting terror, but actually there are connections because, you know, as Pnina says, it's about propaganda, and propaganda is an extremely important means of inspiring support for and acts of terrorism. And of course, you know, the more you can accuse Israel of acting illegally and inhumanly, then the easier it is to get recruits to fight against and carry out terrorist attacks against Israel and to fund those things. So there are connections here.